In September of 1957, somewhere in the closed forests of the southern Ural Mountains, an explosion tore through a facility that officially did not exist. It released more radioactive material into the environment than any event in history except for two: Chernobyl and Fukushima. Dozens of villages were quietly erased from Soviet maps. Tens of thousands of people were relocated without ever being told why. And the Soviet government kept the entire catastrophe a secret from the rest of the world for almost 30 years. This is the story of Kishtim, the nuclear disaster you were never supposed to hear about. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what the Soviet Union was racing to build. After the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, Soviet leadership treated nuclear weapons development as the single highest priority in the entire country. Under immense pressure and with almost no regard for safety, Soviet scientists and engineers built a massive plutonium production complex in the Ural Mountains. It was given an innocent-sounding name, Mayak, meaning lighthouse in Russian. The facility was so secret that it wasn't marked on any public map. The nearest real city, Chelyabinsk, was roughly 70 miles away, and the complex was simply referred to using its postal code, Chelyabinsk 40. It didn't officially exist. Thousands of workers were brought in to build and staff the facility, many of them prisoners from the Gulag system, working under brutal conditions with essentially no understanding of the radiation risks they faced. In the earliest years of Mayak's operation, waste management was almost an afterthought. The priority was producing plutonium as fast as possible to keep pace with the American nuclear program. Liquid radioactive waste from the production process was, for years, simply dumped directly into the nearby Teka River, a river that thousands of people downstream depended on for drinking water, fishing, and agriculture. Entire villages were unknowingly exposed to radiation for years before anyone bothered to warn them. By the mid-1950s, even Soviet authorities recognized that dumping waste into a river used by the public was creating a public health catastrophe that couldn't be hidden forever. So the solution wasn't to stop producing waste. It was to store it differently. Engineers built massive underground steel tanks, each one holding hundreds of tons of highly radioactive liquid waste. To prevent the waste from overheating from its own radioactive decay, each tank was fitted with a cooling system, designed to constantly circulate water around the tank and carry excess heat away. It was a solution built under time pressure by an overworked, secretive program that treated safety monitoring as a lower priority than production quotas. And on the evening of September 29th, 1957, the cooling system on one specific tank failed. Without functioning cooling, the waste inside the tank kept generating heat from its own natural radioactive decay, with nowhere for that heat to go. Slowly, the liquid inside began to evaporate. As it evaporated, what remained behind became a dry, unstable, highly concentrated mixture of nitrate and acetate salts, mixed with intensely radioactive material. It was, in essence, becoming a bomb, sitting quietly underground, and almost nobody at the facility realized it. At around 4:20 in the afternoon, local time, the tank detonated. It wasn't a nuclear explosion in the sense of a mushroom cloud and a fireball. It was a massive chemical explosion, powerful enough to blow off the tank's concrete lid, a slab weighing over 160 tons, and hurl it dozens of meters through the air. The blast released an estimated 20 million curies of radioactive material into the atmosphere, forming a radioactive plume that rose more than a kilometer into the sky before beginning to drift with the wind. Workers at the facility that evening later described a distant, dull explosion and a strange reddish-brown glow lighting up part of the night sky, caused by the ionization of air around the radioactive cloud. Most of them had no idea what had actually happened. Communication about the true nature of the accident was restricted almost immediately, even among many of the people working inside the facility itself. Over the following days, the radioactive plumes settled across an area of roughly 1,000 square kilometers, contaminating a long, narrow strip of land that would later become known as the East Ural radioactive trace. It crossed directly over populated villages, farmland, and forests, exposing an estimated 250,000 people to elevated radiation, most of whom had absolutely no idea anything had happened. For days after the explosion, nothing was announced publicly. No evacuation warning, no explanation. Soviet authorities didn't want to admit that a secret nuclear facility even existed, let alone that it had just experienced one of the worst radiological accidents in human history. Slowly, over the following 1 to 2 weeks, authorities began quietly evacuating the worst affected villages, without ever telling residents the real reason why. Some villagers were simply told there had been an unspecified accident, ordered to leave behind their homes, their livestock, even their pets, and relocated to unfamiliar towns with almost no explanation or compensation. Eventually, somewhere between 10 and 23 villages were evacuated and permanently abandoned, their names quietly removed from Soviet maps, as if the places themselves had simply ceased to exist. To this day, the exact number of villages affected and the exact number of people who died from radiation exposure in the years that followed remains disputed, because Soviet authorities never released complete, transparent records. For nearly 2 decades, almost nobody outside a small circle of Soviet officials and scientists knew Kishtim had happened at all. It wasn't until 1976 that a Soviet defector and dissident scientist named Zoris Medvedev, living in exile in the United Kingdom, first published detailed claims describing a massive nuclear accident in the Ural Mountains. At the time, most Western scientists and officials were openly skeptical. Some publicly dismissed his account as exaggerated or even fabricated, partly because it seemed almost unbelievable that the Soviet Union could have hidden a disaster of this scale for so long, and partly because Cold War-era distrust made it difficult to independently verify anything coming out of a closed, secretive state. It took until the late 1980s and early 1990s, following the political openness of Glasnost and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, for the full scale of the Kishtim disaster to be confirmed through newly released archives and independent scientific study. Only then did the international community fully grasp what had actually happened in September of 1957, and how completely it had been erased from public memory for almost 30 years. Today, the area around the original disaster site remains restricted. Much of the East Ural radioactive trace still shows elevated radiation levels, and portions of it have been designated as a permanent nature reserve, not primarily to protect wildlife, but because the land is still considered too contaminated for safe long-term human habitation. Ironically, this forced absence of human activity has allowed local wildlife populations to recover and, in some strange way, thrive in an area humans are still not fully permitted to occupy. The Mayak facility itself is still operational today, now used for nuclear fuel reprocessing, and it has been linked to several additional, smaller-scale radiological incidents over the decades since 1957. None reaching the scale of the original disaster, but reinforcing a troubling pattern at the site. What makes Kishtim so unsettling isn't just the scale of the contamination, or even the number of people affected. It's the sheer scale of the secrecy. An event that released more radioactive material than nearly any other accident in human history was successfully hidden from the entire world for almost 30 years, not through some elaborate conspiracy, but through the simple, brutal efficiency of a closed society that decided the truth simply wasn't going to be told. Villages that no longer appear on any map, families relocated without ever being told why, a number of deaths that to this day nobody can state with full confidence. Kishtim remains one of the starkest reminders of just how much a government can bury, if it decides silence is easier than the truth. If you want to see more forgotten stories from behind the Iron Curtain, stranger and more unsettling than most people realize, subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.